Welcome to Post Games, a podcast about how and why we love video games. I am your host, Chris Plant, and I am happy to have you with me for the heist of the century. Before us is a planning table. It is covered in blueprints, sticky notes, and red yarn. Here, together, we will devise a plan to steal the greatest thing of all, knowledge. Today, we are talking about Relooted. It is a video game about reconsidering what is possible. Its story is set in a distant future in which Johannesburg, South Africa, has flourished, and America has devolved into a gaudy sprawl of Las Vegas-style excess. And yet, even in this distant future, the white colonial nations have held tightly onto the antiquities, artifacts, relics, and human remains that they stole from the African continent. Were it a film, Relooted would be filed amongst the heist classics like Ocean's 11 and Rafifi. You play as a gymnast, and your collaborators range from a perpetually annoyed IT expert to a retired history professor. True to the genre, the game asks you to assemble your motley crew of talents to outwit the security systems of billionaire private collectors and state-funded museums. Now, you might ask yourself, can a handful of people really rob the most powerful and heavily protected museums on the planet? To which I say, in October 2025, real-life thieves performed one of the most audacious art heists in history, robbing the Louvre by dressing as workmen, raising a crane to a first-floor window, and smashing and grabbing 8 pieces of jewelry valued at a combined $102 million. So yes, a crack team could rob these museums. But as you listen to this episode, I'd like you to consider other things that we assume to be true because of laws and policies, security systems in the literal and the abstract sense. Like, what will it take for the relics, artifacts, and human remains stolen from African nations and now locked largely within the vaults of museums in North America and Europe to be returned? Relooted allows players to experience one scenario, perhaps the most exciting scenario, a series of international heists that would make the Louvre thieves blush. The targets here are something way more valuable than jewels, than wealth. They are a people's history made tangible. This week on Post Games, is it really theft if it's already been stolen? My guests, Ben Myres and Mohale Mashigo, talk about making the repatriation of artifacts fun, the differences between Afrofuturism and Africanfuturism, and art's power to help us imagine a better future so that we can start building toward it. Act 1, stealing what's yours. Act 2, the need for Africanfuturism. A Patreon bonus, what it's actually like making games in South Africa. That one is a trip that you'll want to hear. And Act 3, the news of the week. Listeners, I walked away from this conversation feeling just totally supercharged, and I think you will too. Oh hey gamer buddies, you have been waiting for the perfect time to give your setup the ultimate boost. Well, I've got some great news. Alienware is having their annual Tech Days event, and that means that you can score some pretty crazy deals right now. Save big on new Alienware PCs like Aurora laptops and the Area 51, their most powerful desktop. They both take performance to the next level with Intel Core Ultra processors. There's also some pretty serious deals on Alienware displays, accessories, and more. Check it all out at alienware.com/deals. The whole reason for this annual Tech Days event is to celebrate you. So, I take a good look at these prices and exclusive benefits before it ends. It's easy to save. Just visit alienware.com/deals and snag yourself some great gear at very upgrade-friendly prices. Act 1. Stealing what's yours. Today's guests are Ben Myres and Mohale Mashigo. Ben is the CEO and creative director of Nyamakop. The studio's first game, Semblance, began life as a student project before expanding into a full release in 2018. Since that game, the studio has grown to over 30 people, making it one of the largest game studios in sub-Saharan Africa. Mohale Mashigo is Relooted's narrative director. She is a singer, songwriter, novelist, and former radio presenter. She also writes comics, including Kwezi, and a variety of stories with Marvel. Her writing on African futurism and the limits of Afrofuturism would end up playing a crucial role in Relooted's development, something that we chat about at length. So, let's get to it. Ben, I've heard that the game was inspired by a conversation with your mother. What did she say that stuck with you?
I've always described my mother, and Mohale has met her, so she can confirm, as an angry feminist woman. And I've said this to my mom recently, and she was like, "You're right. That's very true." And so she gets very passionate about things and injustices in the world. And so we were on a visit to London. They went to the British Museum. I went to some game developer meetup, and we met up in the evening, and she was just sort of incensed by something she had seen called the Nyamakop Monument, which is sort of an ancient Lycian tomb, like the front of a building, which they had moved brick by brick from the south of Turkey into the British Museum. And she was just sort of, I don't know, shocked at the audacity of doing that. Like, there's this joke, why, the pyramids are too big to steal, otherwise they'd be in the British Museum. Well, they've stolen a few buildings before, apparently. So she was just kind of shocked at that. And sort of flippantly said I should make a game about, bringing this building back to the south of Turkey. I have no idea how to make that fun. I still haven't figured it out. So very quickly we went smaller scale African artifacts, because that's kind of, been a conversation on the continent for decades. But yes, mothers are always right. And she doesn't even get a proper credit in the game. It really should say concept by Ben's mom, but it doesn't quite happen.
It's not too late. We haven't finalized the credits. So, I mean...
That is true.
It's coming. There is this centerpiece of the game from which I feel everything, the story, the concept, even the gameplay radiates. And that is an empty display hall in Senegal. Can you tell folks about it?
When we were working on the game and researching it, we would come across a lot of random stuff about African artifact restitution, and we came across this place called the Museum of Black Civilizations in Dakar, Senegal. And the story behind it is really interesting, because the game's sort of like internal placeholder title for a long time was Senghor's Rebels, because Senghor was the first democratically elected president of Senegal, but he was a poet before he went into politics. So when he did become president, he put all this money into the arts in Senegal, but his really big dream was to have a museum in Dakar, Senegal, where they could bring culture from across the continent into one place. And he died before he saw it open, but that museum opened in the mid-2010s, and it's called the Museum of Black Civilizations in Dakar, Senegal. And I think there were a few interviews I read with some of the curators who sort of alluded to the fact that the museum was deliberately being left empty as much as possible because they were waiting for all the artifacts to come back from the West. And so that was just such a beautiful poetic idea that I was like, what if we just fill that museum up real nice? So in the game, we sort of very dutifully recreate the outside of that museum and then sort of vastly expand the actual interior size to make the point. And so in the beginning, you'll see it very empty. And by the end of the game, you'll see it full with all the artifacts that have been reclaimed and repatriated. And that's sort of a central staging area for the artifacts to go back to all the people they were taken from.
People actually think we made up this museum, which is, I'm a novelist, and if I had written that, if it wasn't a real museum, my editor would have immediately been like, stop, that's going too far. But it's a real museum, which is what makes it so brilliant. It's the only real museum in the game.
We are absolutely coming back to that question in just a moment. But before we get to that, Mohale, when I first heard about the game, I pictured a series of museum heists. That's kind of the, I guess, top-level art concept. But most of these objects in the game and in the real world, from what I can tell, aren't actually in museums. Where are they?
So there are a lot of, and I mean, this is something that I learned while we were researching all of these artifacts. You sort of have an idea of the looting, and I think most people think these things are all in museums, but a lot of them are in private collections, which is so wild to me because it's like, that's a whole people's, heritage, cultural heritage, and it's sitting in somebody's grandfather's private collection and it's passed down like a family heirloom. So most of the heists do happen in museums in the game, but we do have a couple of private collections.
It's interesting. Even with the museums, each heist is, for me, rung as a different tone in a different setting. There is like a stuffy museum heist, of course. There's also a wealthy executive heist. There is a horror mansion heist. Why was it important for y'all to vary not just the locations, but like the actual tone and genre?
Well, I think it's that thing, right, where you don't realize how some of these artifacts are actually the equivalent of tombstones, and House of Horrors are nothing new. They've had human remains in private collections and in public collections. And I think showing these different spaces was to show that it's not just the museums. Something is taken from the Kingdom of Benin and winds up with no context in a very weird place. And so it would have been easier to just have a bunch of museums. But actually, the way these artifacts have been scattered through the world in different circumstances was also pretty compelling.
But it's also, I think, because your brain was just heists, Mohale. Like, Mohale watched pretty much every heist movie ever made. She was reading books actually about heists and how you can do a heist and things like that. Like, Mohale's brain was just heists. So I think all those settings, I don't know if it was ever consciously that, but it almost ended up being like a love letter to the heist genre and all the different like references to different heists that have taken place in real life or in movies. I think that variety was also there. Because it's like, museums are really boring looking, let's be honest. The white cube, it's not fun. Like, from an art direction perspective, you need a little bit of variety there. Yeah.
And they are apparently really easy to break into.
Yeah. Yeah. All you need is a ladder and a car, especially if you're in France.
Yeah. This would have saved us a lot of time if we'd known that earlier, honestly.
Yeah, if anybody questions the legitimacy and believability of this video game, your team works much harder to heist these museums than people in real life. I do, as I'm laughing, I want to dig deeper into the House of Horror, because this is the gut punch of the game. The game does an incredible job of talking about history. I want to come back to that too. But there is a sequence about 5 hours in where you are not reclaiming just artifacts, you're reclaiming human remains. Can you tell people more about both the history of how human remains would end up in, say, a private collection, and also the difference of archaeologists who are digging up artifacts, but then also digging up skulls or other body parts?
Well, I think as South Africans, we have a very famous case of human remains that were essentially in a museum for a long time, taken under nefarious, it's a woman, Sarah Bartman, and she was taken from the continent. And reading more into her history, she had also been used as a sex worker, and then they started experimenting on her body because it looked different. And then when she died, they stuffed her and kept her in a museum. So this is something that's always been top of mind for me as a South African woman. And then finding out that somewhere very far away, somebody had Patrice Lumumba's tooth, right? And it's just these horrific things. And then you hear about how people's skulls were taken, for phrenological testing. And it's kind of like, that's a horrible history. And it was really interesting to have a level where we could say, listen, these are human remains. And one of the artifacts actually, Pedro from the Amazon, they call him, was a head that was in a museum in Italy, but it was like in storage. And when they found it, they were like, oh, interesting, a head. And they called him Pedro from the Amazon. So this is not something that is very rare when it comes to human remains. I think House of Horrors was a good level to explore that, as well as fictionally being able to find Mangimeli's skull, because nobody knows, where it is.
I mean, there's literally an interview with his great-grandson on the BBC talking about trying to find his great-grandfather's skull. And they don't know because they have so many of them, and there's just piles of skulls in Germany. So we downplay it a bit in the game, even. The real story is way more horrifying.
I found it incredibly moving and incredibly fun. Not that part, but the game. And that's the other part that I want to talk about is how the hell do you do that? How do you balance that? Because what you're talking about here is not just serious in a historical sense, but serious in a really, these are human remains at times. These are things that belong to families, and yet it's a fun video game where you heist things. How did you find the ability to balance that tone?
Okay, fine. I'll answer this one, Mohale. I guess.
Go ahead, Ben.
No, yeah, thanks. Great. No, I think we actually made the decision very early on to focus on joy, and we spoke a lot about, I think, particularly black joy. And this is why I'm like, Mohale, why on earth are you making me answer this? But I think oftentimes a lot of the movies that get made about black people or about African people are not joyful, right? It's about slavery, or it's about a famine, or it's about a genocide in Africa. And so we made a very conscious decision to, as much as the subject matter was incredibly serious, to make it as lighthearted and joyful as possible. Because the core, spirit of the game is joyful. There's a celebration of reclaiming heritage and bringing it back to where it should be. So I think we never felt like the characters should be moping around. It's obviously difficult to avoid because we sort of just lay it out there in terms of the real history of these artifacts. But the way the characters talk about it, it's, poignant for moments here and there, and there's lots of moments of poignancy through the game, but the rest of the time you're just listening to that delinquent little brother Trevor cracking jokes endlessly, and so we just felt like the real history of the artifacts was serious and intense enough that we maybe didn't need to do any more work than that, and so let's just make it fun. There were definitely decisions we made that around particularly caring for the artifacts. We could have made a more fun game at certain points, but that would have led to treating the artifacts with less respect. There was a very fun prototype at one point where you could break the artifacts and the text would come up and say, "Don't break the African artifact." But that didn't really feel tonally appropriate, so we didn't end up doing that.
But also, the heist genre itself is fun.
Yes.
I think after watching millions of heist movies, I'm like, these are thieves, but I'm rooting for them.
There's a really cool trick that you all do with the pacing of this game. And it's three parts. There is the, mission onboarding. There is the casing of the space where you're actually in there and setting up your path. And then there's the escape. During those first two parts, though, there is a tremendous amount of history lessons going on. And I don't know if this is a term that y'all are familiar with, but edutainment is what they would call it. When I was in school, you would watch Bill Nye the Science Guy.
This has come up a lot. Edutainment.
Yes, but I love that phrase. Some people see it as a negative. It is what I aspire to in life. How are you thinking about educating people during these first two phases that on one hand you're planning a heist, on the other hand you're learning a lot about history?
I think it's that planning stage, right, Ben? It's heists have got the planning stage where you're learning. If they're stealing a diamond, they're learning who had this diamond first, then who stole it, and now where we think it is. And so the planning phase of a heist is always learning about the thing you're taking and then learning about the security. So the planning phase of a heist for me is always my favorite.
Yeah, and I think we know there's players that won't be interested in that. And actually, we hope there's players who aren't interested in that play the game, because we spent a lot of programmer time making all of that very skippable if you wanted to. You can skip most of that. there is a setting in the game literally called Spare Me the Details, where you can literally skip all of that if you want to.
But that will hurt my feelings because I worked really hard on the details.
Well, it's not about you, Mohale.
I will say that, Mala, you opened my eyes of how the goal in a heist is to know the stakes of the thing that you're stealing. And it's kind of a perfect sleight of hand, because the way to learn the stakes of something is to be taught to care about it. And that is such an opportunity.
I don't think we thought about it that poetically. That would have been useful to know, but yes, that's good. Oh, you
Speak
thought
for
about it that
yourself,
way?
Benjamin.
Okay, fine. You never brought that up. Okay, fine. Sorry.
It's good that you're in different locations. The bloodbath that we're avoiding right now is real. You said earlier that you chose not to use real museums. Why did you choose that?
As tempted as I was for a cease and desist from the British Museum, which honestly, I could have spun that for a long time. Good Lord.
Yeah.
The press we could have gotten off that. I think the game isn't about museums. It's about the artifacts. That's the first thing. It's just like, we don't want it to be about, let's talk about the British Museum. And also, like, there's a socio-political thing to what you spend money on when making a game like this. Do we want to spend all this money dutifully recreating museums in the West? Or do we want to rather spend it on, like, authentic African voice actors? So, like, there is both this very pragmatic decision of, like, what should we spend our time and energy on? For us, it didn't really make sense to spend all that time recreating those museums. Frankly, as well, from a gameplay perspective, really hard to make some of those spaces work for how the gameplay worked. And then, fourthly, I think we sort of eventually evolved on this idea of parodying the way the West represents Africa sort of as a country by doing the same thing back to the West. So when you go to Europe, it's the old world. It's generically European. When you go to the US, it's called the shiny place. And it's like a cross between Times Square and the Las Vegas Strip. It's just so absurd, right? But we sort of want to parody this like lack of sense of place that is applied to representing Africa by doing the same thing back. And the only real places in the game are in Africa. So it was both a pragmatic decision, and then later we came up with a flowery, poetic answer for interviews like this. That's probably the real answer.
This is a game about retrieving the artifacts and returning them to their nations. But Mohale, you said that you hope the game gets people to think about what happened before these heists took place. I'd love to hear you unpack that one a bit further.
I think when we, and I'll speak for myself, but when I started this project, I sort of had an idea about the scope of looting, when it took place, how it took place. But you never really have an idea of what happened before these artifacts wound up where they are today. Right. And they've got very, very interesting stories. In fact, when we were starting to choose artifacts, we handled it like this. Is it a teacup or is it a throne? And the analogy I used was, if I broke into Buckingham Palace and I stole a teacup, they'd be kind of pissed off with me. But if I stole a throne, they would be mad. So we started looking for artifacts that were a throne and not a teacup, because there were so many artifacts. And we were also looking for artifacts with interesting information, because, I mean, this is storytelling at the end of the day. But while we were doing this, there are these artifacts, Vigango statues, and they weren't removed during colonial times. They were removed in the 80s. And so it's just about letting people know that this wasn't just however many 100 years ago when it was somebody's great-great-grandfather. There were art dealers in the 80s who were taking what were essentially tombstones of people who were important to the Mijikenda people and selling them. And they were Hollywood stars had, I don't know if some of them still do, I don't suppose they'll admit to it, had these statues in their homes. And those kinds of stories are interesting because you can say, oh, colonial times, whatever. The 80s, though?
Before we switch to the next segment, there's two relics, I guess, in the game that really stuck with me. And I don't know the story behind them, which is the two lead adult children in the game hold on to their parents' wedding rings, which I found to be a really interesting decision in this game. And I'm curious what that meant to you to include that in the story.
So when I was creating these characters, I also wanted them to be people with interesting backstories, right? So you can understand why a perfectly sensible woman who's got a job in Tanzania working with the best gymnastics team on the continent goes to rescue her delinquent young brother, and they needed to be bonded in a way that it's like, okay, they lost their parents when they were really young. I think there was a practical reason for why it was the rings, because that first level is a tutorial level, but also the significance of, even everybody has some kind of artifact in their life, something that's important for you to go get. Regardless of how unimportant it is to other people, it means something to them.
Let's take a quick break, and then we will come back and we'll talk about the ideas and the ideas behind this game. If you're like me, then you want to be eating better food. And when I say better food, not just tastier food, that is a priority, but also food that makes you feel good, that is good for you. And unfortunately, you just don't have time and you don't have energy because life is a lot. Which is why I am so grateful for Factor. They have meals designed by chefs and dietitians, and they're just delivered right to my door. I heat it for 2 minutes and I eat. Whatever your dietary needs, they got you covered. And I know this because we have some unusual health issues in our family where my wife needs to eat more carbs, I need to eat fewer carbs, and we have been able to design our meal plan with all of that in mind. You want lean protein, you want colorful vegetables, you want whole food ingredients, healthy fats, they got that for you. My favorite meal so far is the ginger teriyaki salmon, but really you can't go wrong with over 100 rotating meals every week, ranging from all of those dietary needs, from high protein to GLP-1 support. It's always fresh, never frozen, ready in 2 minutes, basically the length of this ad. No prep, no cleanup, no mental load, and you're gonna feel good about eating better. I eat Factor. I love it. I think that you will too. So head to factormeals.com/postgames50off and use postgames50off to get 50% off your first Factor box plus free breakfast for 1 year. Free breakfast for 1 year. You got to go do that. factormeals.com/postgames50off or 50 off, however you want to put it, with code postgames50off. Make healthier eating easy with Factor. Act 2, the need for African futurism. Mohale, you described the game as African futurism. What is the difference between Afrofuturism and African futurism?
So in 2018, I wrote a collection of short stories that were basically me taking all of the fic, tropes and genres and putting them in South Africa. And as my editor, my publisher said, well, people are going to think this is Afrofuturism. And I then was like, I was initially like, I don't know. And then I went and researched where this term Afrofuturism comes from, because I just wasn't comfortable with using it. It just didn't feel like it was something that I did. And then I wrote this essay, Afrofuturism is not for Africans living in Africa. Turns out Nydia Okorafor was also struggling with the same thing of, Afrofuturism, and she calls it African futurists, African jujuism. So I always say people can choose their own term, but African futurist is like Africans in Africa imagining a future that only a person from the continent could imagine, because we don't have a lot of opportunities to see ourselves reflected in the future, because it's always in the hands of someone else, right? And also an opportunity for me to say, I know what my culture is. My culture is not a costume. I know we're all different people in Africa, and that we get that out of the way immediately. So African futurism for me is Africans in Africa imagining a future.
Ben, you said the game began as an Afrofuturist game and that changed when Mohale joined. What were those creative conversations between you two like?
It wasn't really a conversation so much as an instruction from Mohale.
I wish people could have seen Mohale's face before you even talked, because it actually said it all.
No. I mean, Mohale literally forced me to hire her. There was no option. I was bullied into it. Thank God she did that. No, it was a very easy conversation. I think for me, being a white South African, I think I had to be very conscious of the game we were making and the game I was driving forward, and had to work and listen as much as possible to actual Black Africans working on this. And so there were a lot of times in those conversations where things like this would come up, and it would be a relatively short discussion. Mohale luckily had written that essay. She sent it to me, and I was like, oh yeah, that was easy. I guess it's African Futurist now. Mohale is very good at painting the picture for me. She won't just be like, it's African Futurism. She'll be like, African Futurism allows us to do X, Y, and Z. And then we'll have a debate and a discussion. And by the end of it, it's very clear that she was right the whole time. It's a very annoying process. You have to have a very, very, very strong ego to work with Mohale, because she'll beat you down by being right all the time.
Can I get a recording of this? He never says I'm right. I need this, and I'm going to make it my voicemail.
This is why you do podcast. It's great. Everyone's going to get a recording of this pretty soon. Mohale, you said that you want African Futurism to ask, what does the continent look like in the future? And when I read your essay, it reminds me of conversations in America and the civil rights movement in relation to the space program of, why are we worrying about these problems? We have so many problems here to take care of. But at the same time, you said that you want African Futurism to have the space to kind of step away from the now. And that part, I would love to know more about. Why is that distance from the present so important?
Because it's so limiting, right? When you're working with whatever it is that you have right now, there's very little imagination involved in it. And if you can't let people's imagination run wild, then they can't imagine a better future, right? Because it's almost like time is not linear. It's not a straight line. And so whatever it is that we're imagining now, somebody is going to look at it. An engineering student, I don't know, 20 years from now is going to look at it and go, actually, I think I can do that and I can find a better use for it. But if we keep telling stories that are based right now, the present is what it is. But if we can start imagining, somebody is going to make some of those things happen. And I think specifically when we talk about African storytelling, there is a lot of pressure to be like, well, reflect the times as they are now. And I'm like, no, shut up. Don't tell us what to do. Excuse you. We'll imagine whatever we want to imagine. And absolutely, let's start imagining Africa in the future, no matter how wild or fantastical it is.
There is another video game that is in the room with Relooted, and that is Tomb Raider. A game that is explained by the name Tomb Raider. Is Relooted in any way a response to that series? Were you thinking about that series while you were making it?
Surprisingly little. I mean, I think we were often, obviously very aware of it. I grew up playing Lara Croft and all those sort of games. My dog...
And you named one of your dogs
Exactly,
Lara Croft.
My first dog was Indiana Jones. My second dog was Lara Croft, and they both died in the development of this game. So that's poetic, I guess.
Wow.
I love those stories. At least I do. But I think we were very aware of how it was like a sort of reverse version of those things. But we didn't really play them and analyze them to figure out how to reverse them. Because again, it's like, through centering those things, you're making something in response to them instead of making your own thing. So it's like you're still centering those ideas rather than creating your own versions of them. So we were obviously aware of them, we've played them, but it wasn't an inherent part of the development process to reference them necessarily. Yeah.
Well, we do in one level where Etienne is so excited they're getting a soapstone eagle from Zimbabwe, and he says this is real Indiana Jones stuff. And Cryptic says, Indian who?
I did have an idea for the announcement trailer, which I'm really sad we couldn't do. It's like the classic Indiana Jones lifting up his hat thing, and then Mohale runs past and bustles him over, and you just hear like the first few chords of the Indiana Jones theme, and then he gets knocked over as Mohale runs past. It's so good. So we definitely thought about it a little bit, but it wasn't like deeply entrenched in the development, I don't think. Yeah.
Now I'm going to try to walk one hell of a tightrope because it's just a question that is so beyond my reach. You have received, I would say, a toxic response to the game from a very American European corner of games left over from Gamergate. And they don't seem to realize that Relooted is made by people across the continent of Africa, and that relationships with race are different across the continent than they are in the United States and Europe. Can you explain how your game about the lives and cultures of Black people from across Africa contrasts with the expectations of the Western audience that often applies, I would say, a very American or Eurocentric history and politics to the entertainment it consumes?
Tightrope walked. Very good job. That was eloquently done. You want to answer this first, or shall I take a stab?
I'm afraid I will go rogue.
Okay, I'll go first. I think you've kind of nailed the question perfectly, because that is exactly at least how I feel about it. And I think we always knew there would be some sort of, like, quote unquote backlash. I think that's a euphemism to it. But I think, ironically, we didn't realize how much attention the game would get, and therefore how much it would attract that sort of response. And I think the main sort of conclusion I came to is that I don't want to speak for the rest of the team because everyone has different thoughts on this, but I was in a bubble living in South Africa, and I didn't quite realize and remember how little people know about Africa. And releasing and announcing the game made me realize how little people still know about Africa. Because some of the things people say are just hilarious. I'm like, you should play this game because the answer is in it, you know? Like, the thing you think is true is not, and the game has the answers, you know? People say things like, oh, you know, they just found this in the dirt, and we saved this cultural artifact they didn't care about. And I'm like, well, if you actually play the game, you can see these civilizations were existing at the time, holding on to these artifacts at the time they were taken. So it was fascinating to see that sort of like lack of understanding about Africa combined with like the general Western European American ideas around race and how they sort of like fed into each other, and the sort of conversations about race in the US and Europe were, like you said, being projected onto us as a mostly Black African development team. And it was and continues to be rather strange. Someone said this is another example of a AAA flop, though. And I was like, AAA, though? That is good. That we made it. Production values, we did it. And I was like, that's pretty funny. So
I think for me, it's a perception thing. Because of cultural imperialism, we've been fed other people's cultures, and we've always been looking at other people's cultures. You know, we're very familiar with what happens in the West. And this was the first time that I realized what it looks like when people look back at you, but don't have a lens to use looking back at you, that they only use a home lens. And so it was really interesting. And I was like, oh my goodness, well, I hope this means that people know that, one, we're making games in Africa. We exist, and sometimes just approach the thing for what it is, you know, without, and or finding new lens to encounter African content. Because like I said, I can tell you sometimes I'm watching a movie and I'm like, this was shot in Chicago. I know. Why do I know that? Because I've been consuming so much American media, right? And so I know useless things that I shouldn't know. And for the first time, we're being perceived, and people may not know how to perceive us. And so it's like, welcome. It's an invitation to see what's happening over here and how we perceive the world.
I'm not answering first again, Mohale. You just come up with these poetic things right after me and make me ramble first. It's ridiculous.
I first had to go, don't go rogue. Say what you feel.
But it has helped in that you have set up some questions, including the next one, which is you talked about the lack of really basic understanding of Africa and specifically South Africa, where both of you are based. Do you feel a pressure larger than your own ambitions for the project to succeed on behalf of where you live?
I know Mohale's answers to this.
I wish it wasn't this way, but I'm painfully ambitious. And if it means that some of my ambition does something good for someone else, then yeah. I wish I wasn't ambitious because then I wouldn't have forced Ben to hire me. But yeah, it's unfair. But yeah, I do feel that pressure.
Yeah, I definitely feel this pressure. And this is something we talk about actually quite a lot in the African game development scene is, are African-inspired and themed games feasible, financially and commercially viable? This is a conversation that we've been having for close to a decade with devs from South Africa through the rest of the continent. And I think in some ways Relooted is the strongest inherent concept that has to be African-themed and inspired, like to its core, that we've seen come out of the continent. And it's also, by budget, team size, and scope, the largest game ever made in sub-Saharan Africa by quite a distance. So even while making it, I think I knew it mattered and it was important to a lot of things in a very specific way, even if it wasn't always the most financially sound thing to do. Try finding an English accent from Angola. Someone from Angola who speaks, is a voice actor. Someone from Cameroon who's done voice acting. That is very difficult. It's possibly unnecessary. Black Panther just taught some Americans how to do an accent, and it worked out fine. But for us, it was fine. It was important to instill the game with this in every corner.
Africanfuturism?
Chris, protect me. She's always right. And I think it's because it might be, especially with the funding situation in games generally, it might be a while before another African game dev team making an African-themed or inspired game gets as big a swing at it as we have. And so that does feel very important.
To wrap this section up, what does success look like? And that can be financial, it can be creative, it can be personal, it can be anything.
I talk about yachts a lot.
Ben and I both want to have at least 2 yachts.
100%.
We joke about this a lot, Ben having yachts.
Yeah.
I don't know what success looks like, actually, because playing the game now that we're stress testing it or, doing QA, I feel very successful at having done this game. I don't know what it looks like once it's out in the world. Maybe having enough money to make another.
Yes, that's definitely the first one. I think because of the way we made this game over such a long period of time, while obviously we'd love to have it be hugely financially successful because of A, what it does for my yacht budget, but secondly, because of what it allows other African game developers to do and what stories they can tell if it does well. As great as that would be, I think because of the way we made the game, finishing it alone is hugely successful. Most of the team had never made a video game before, not even close to it. And so shipping a project of this sort of scale with a team like that, and I'm not talking about Expedition 33 never made a game before, not a single, never worked at a game company, never made a game before, not even close to games.
Yeah.
Not even sure Mohale knew what games were until I asked her.
I always say my favorite game is Zippy Race. Give me a break.
No one knows what Zippy Race is, Mohale. You've said it on the record now. It's too late. So yeah, the way we made it. You can't even, I'm trying to be poetic and you're interrupting me, Mohale. Be fair.
I'm literally Googling, is real Zippy Race?
Yeah. Yeah. So the way we made it, I think, is amazing. And then I think also for me, it's the cultural impact, which can be separated from the financial impact. The amount of interest we've had from particularly outside of games is frankly absurd. I don't know many indie games that have been on Al Jazeera, CNN, BBC. We have meetings with UNESCO. We've been in mainstream art publications. It's there is a lot of interest for this idea. And so the cultural impact seems pretty significant. And that is a pretty amazing success.
Well. Yeah. Yeah. it's tricky doing journalism because my job is not to, like champion or crush projects. It is to like ask questions, right? But there's one thing that I really do want to hammer home, and I said it earlier, is the game's just really fun. And I think what can get lost in what you just said, I'm not trying to undercut your answer here,
no,
is there are a lot of games that are important, right? But not every important game is fun, and certainly every fun game is not important. And it's arresting to play this game and see how well it succeeds at being both. So if you are listening to this and you're like, wow, I learned so much, but like, there's so many fun games to play, this is one of them. And with that, we're going to come back for another section, but I want to throw to you so you can say, where can people go and get this game right now?
It's coming out on February 10th on Steam, Epic Games Store, on Xbox Series X, Xbox Play Anywhere, or at your nearest museum. Well, you can cut that out maybe. Close enough.
Patreon bonus, what it's actually like making games in South Africa. You know how this works. This is where we split up. Patreon subscribers, I've got something special here for you. Ben and Mohale stick around to tell us about what it is actually like making games in South Africa. Undoing a lot of assumptions, I would say, about the experience, talking about the many benefits and some very real challenges, including electricity in a way that might surprise you. It is a great conversation. I learned so much from it. And for everybody else, don't worry, we still have plenty more show, including the news of the week and an original song from Relooted to take us out. Act 3, the news of the week. For the news of the week, I have a special guest to talk about a sensitive topic, the Epstein files and their relation to video games. Nathan Grayson is the co-owner of Aftermath, a reporter with experience covering everything from labor to live streaming. Nathan wrote a great piece detailing the ways that Epstein's connection with leaders in the video game space tied to, in some ways quite explicitly, the worst parts of video game culture. It is a really interesting piece, and he joins us to help unpack all of it. I assume that everybody listening is broadly aware of Jeffrey Epstein. Some folks might not have been following the recent back and forth, though, between Congress and the Department of Justice. Can you tell people what's so important about this specific tranche of files versus previous dumps of information from the Department of Justice?
I mean, mainly it's that they are doing it at all after a ton of, hemming and hawing and being like, oh yeah, we're for sure going to release all of the Epstein files because, the people have been asking. And now they're finally doing it in these kind of like little piecemeal releases where they redact everything. There is still information coming out. They also have tried to make sure that no one sees the links between Trump and the Epstein files, but they keep messing that up too, and not redacting certain parts, which seem, again, we have to use careful language, but certainly seem to implicate him in some less than savory acts, potentially, allegedly, etc.
Yes. Yeah, here's where I will use my legalese, which is to say we're going to talk about a number of people here. And legally appearing in these files does not mean someone has committed a crime. We're not a court of law. That said, who are some of the video game industry figures that appear to be in these emails?
Yeah. So some of the names that people who listen to your show might know are first and foremost Bobby Kotick, and then Leslie Benzies, who used to work at Rockstar as the head of Rockstar North and now runs Build a Rocket Boy studio, which recently released Mind's Eye, a game that did quite poorly. And then in relation to Benzies, Sam Houser, who's the current president of Rockstar.
Some of the most powerful people in the history of games, basically.
Yeah, some very big names.
Have any of them spoken about their names appearing in the emails?
Yes, Benzies gave a statement to Kotaku saying that the allegations are false, basically. And so the allegations being that Benzies had sexually assaulted one of the victims of other, Epstein-related kind of incidents. And that part of the entire thing is very strange, too, because it kind of just comes out of nowhere. And this person basically accuses Benzies of doing terrible things and then says, like, oh, and by the way, when this relationship was happening, like, Sam was aware, you were around, you saw us together. So, yeah, but it's all very odd. And then Benzies said, these allegations are false. I had a 3-month consensual relationship with this person. I have never met Jeffrey Epstein, nor have I ever visited his island, his properties, or traveled on his plane. Any suggestion otherwise is misleading.
What are these emails actually discussing? You gave a little bit of the Benzies emails, but what else are we seeing here?
Yeah. So, I mean, the main person who, at least in that cohort, exchanged a lot of emails with Epstein was Bobby Kotick. And so with Kotick, it's this like initial back and forth of Epstein wanting to meet up with Bobby Kotick and them trying to make plans in November 2012 in New York specifically. Initially, Bobby Kotick was like, hey, come hang out with me and Woody Allen. And then it seemed like maybe he wasn't going to be able to make it. But then Epstein on November 18th, which was the day after the plan for that dinner, was like, Bobby Kotick came over last night. He's great. In an email to another person, a person who, incidentally, as a result of her association with Epstein, has stepped down from her job at Next Model Management. And then they kept talking. In December 2012, Epstein and Kotick exchanged emails again. Kotick had apparently been on a trip to the Caribbean and was like, I wish I could have stopped by the island, which again does not suggest that he necessarily did, but that he potentially intended to. 2013, Epstein was saying, like, my Russian guest missed your arrival yesterday. Kotick replied, and I missed her. I'll see you both next trip. So this implies a lot of familiarity and a lot of intentionality around, like, let's meet up, or let's meet up with associates. And so then in that same year, Epstein had also been going back and forth with this like hacker, inventory, technology futurist guy named Pablos Holman. And they'd been talking about like the idea of edutainment and educational games. And so like Holman had sent Epstein this entire fairly unhinged screed of like how you should do edutainment and how you should use more traditional video game mechanics and themes to, keep like kids interested.
I will say, because the episode that this is appearing in is talking about Relooted, a game that I like a lot, that I think is borrowing from edutainment in really interesting ways. This conversation is basically saying, I think at one point, fuck edutainment, almost like explicitly.
No, it's better than that. The line is, edutainment is for pussies.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And do you want to give a description of what the theoretical replacement would be? Because it is itself quite grotesque.
Yeah. So I'm just going to read you the direct quote.
Please.
Content warning, everything. All right. So he says, imagine you were looking at a door in a video game. It has some squiggly symbols printed on it. Little munchkins walk up to that door and say, Konnichiwa. The door opens and they are greeted by a hot princess with big tits and a thong. The door closes in your face. You are going to fucking learn to read and pronounce kanji. He says later, we have to keep the boobs and guns and profit. You see how much money video games are making these days? Fuck educational reform. We need educational subversion. He says, unleash that on 5th grade boys, and the next thing you know, you'll have an entire generation of bilingual kids. So, like, that's for 5th graders. Which, in the context of the rest of this, does not feel out of place.
And again, just to be clear here, there are two parallel things happening. There are these conversations with the rich and powerful, some of whom are in the games industry. And then there is this separate thing, which is Epstein's own interest in the power of video games. Do those start to come together? Does it seem like there's a unified connection between these things?
I would say absolutely. Like an ongoing trend in some of these emails, and I get to this later in the article, but even with other figures who are sort of more tangentially relevant to video games, people like Peter Thiel and Steve Bannon, is this interest in currencies, online currencies, and their ability to supplant real-world currencies and give people like this greater control over, the comings and goings of people, and then also just generally, people's thoughts and feelings and opinions. Just to kind of correct the record some, there's been a lot of talk this week about the idea that like Epstein somehow is the reason that Activision started embracing microtransactions. That is not correct. This conversation, again, is what people have been referencing, and that is mainly Bobby Kotick and Pablo Holman talking. And like Activision itself had recently added microtransactions to Call of Duty Black Ops 2 and was about to release Call of Duty Ghosts. Game development takes a long time. They would not have, Bobby would not have seen this email and then been like, we got to do that. That's just not how anything works. But yeah, so Epstein kept having conversations with other people about, various currencies and game design ideas. He talked to a kind of Bitcoin contributor named Jeremy Rubin about, and this is another like very unhinged one. Rubin mentioned the idea of creating a quote unquote intellectually stimulating game where women outperform men as a test of either like, providing evidence of universal inferiority on the part of women, of course, which would inform society to not invest in gender diversity, or if the experiment was successful, to help them learn how to basically extract the most profit from female employees. So again, these mechanisms for like control of learning how best to exploit people to some sort of intended end.
There are surely people hearing this thinking, this sounds very familiar. This sounds very Gamergate. It's not even red yarn at this point.
Yeah. I mean, the most direct connection here is that basically Epstein was talking with Peter Thiel for a while. Peter Thiel is the basically like tech industry person, PayPal, Palantir, etc., who bankrolled Hulk Hogan's lawsuit against Gawker, which basically took down and bankrupted Gawker. Gawker owned Kotaku at the time. Kotaku was one of the prime targets of Gamergate. Disclosure for reasons related to me.
Yeah.
At least, that was the stated reason. The actual reason is the Gamergate wanted to go after a bunch of people and they just needed an excuse. But yeah, so basically Epstein messaged Peter Thiel after the Gawker lawsuit had kind of wrapped up and said, and I quote, that he would have gladly shared your expenses for the Gawker suit. So this is stuff that Epstein was watching and was cognizant of. And that also, ties in pretty closely with, I think, one of the main connections that is expressed, at least in the emails, for kind of the final period of his life, which is he was close with Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon ended up becoming the kind of head of Breitbart, which is a far-right publication that essentially legitimized Gamergate. They employed Milo Yiannopoulos, who turned Gamergate into kind of his pet project at the time and recognized it as a very effective vector for kind of winning young people over to these increasingly far-right ideals.
What I really found valuable about your piece, and you got to this a little bit earlier too, of Epstein did not create video game currency manipulation and exploitation of young children. But what the piece shows is that a lot of nefarious players, one, are friends, and two, are in almost constant conversation with one another. And that it is not as simple as, yes, there's the yarn on the corkboard that is making every connection, but it is more like one giant toxic cloud. Mm-hmm. And that can be just as unsettling, if not more unsettling, because it is more abstract. Have we seen any repercussions or accountability amongst the people who we've talked about here since this has become public?
No, not really. I mean, aside from Benzi's kind of issuing a statement. But yeah, for the others, they've been fine. And like, that's sort of how it tends to go, right? Like, you can make a similar argument that, under Bobby Kotick's tenure at Activision, like, there were many things that happened that people didn't agree with, whether it was the evolution of their games or layoffs or things like that. And on his way out, he got an enormous golden parachute that will keep him wealthy for all his days. That's how these things tend to go. I think that it's also interesting to view this through the lens of what we kind of can glean from these emails versus not. Again, you have to go back to the fact that so far, like, that being in these emails does not necessarily imply that you are guilty of, incredible malfeasance. But I think that these are a snapshot of a point in time. And that point in time kind of led to where we are now. And so this was the moment when a lot of these kind of like tech industry and tech industry adjacent people, A, began embracing social media, and B, began kind of being like, well, scruples be damned, I want power. And so they recognized both things like Gamergate and social media as means by which to do that. And so in this moment where back then you had all these people being the canaries in the coal mine for Gamergate and saying like, you got to decry this, you got to like distance yourself from it, to game companies, to social media companies and whatnot. And those companies instead, you know, allowed Gamergate views to propagate in their communities, or even in some cases embrace them. You know, that did, I think, lead to this moment. Like what is in the files could be seen as kind of the beginning of this allegiance between big tech and the far right. And what we're living in now is the culmination of that. You know, without all of this other stuff, you don't get ice in the streets.
And I will say, yes, while we are being very careful here not to say criminal liability, it is worth noting that Epstein pleads guilty to state charges against him in June 2008. Almost all of these emails that we're talking about take place after that.
Yeah, the ones I'm referencing specifically, literally all of them do. Every single one.
So this is who this person is known. And the decision to continue to engage with this person is absolutely grotesque, whether or not it's illegal. Well, I want to go barf, which is a great way to start my morning. But thank you so much for both doing this, Nathan, and also continuing to report these stories, because I don't know how you manage to keep your food down. Where can people go read and support you again?
Yeah, so I am one of the founders of Aftermath. You can find us at aftermath.site. We are a worker-owned and reader-supported website about video games and the internet. And if you like what you see, please consider subscribing. That is our livelihood, and that's how we are able to do cool stuff and take a lot of time researching pieces that other sites might have to do, you know, in a smaller or piecemeal fashion. So yeah, be tremendously appreciated. And thanks.
I subscribe. I think you should too. Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you.
Listeners, we did not solve systemic problems about the repatriation of artifacts, but we did learn a lot about it, and that is a good first step. Next week, Mewgenics is the only video game title with the guts to blend cats and eugenics. Yes, the one and only Edmund McMillan joins the show. McMillan is best known for co-creating Super Meat Boy and The Binding of Isaac, but he's been making games for over 25 years, dating back to some truly gnarly Flash games on Newgrounds. You also might know Edmund McMillan from appearing in indie game The Movie. Now, some listeners may be skittish to listen to a conversation about some very heavy topics. And let me tell you, this episode, it's about some really heavy topics. To which I say, for all that's holy, please listen. This is one of the most vulnerable and enlightening interviews of my career. Lots of laughs, lots of tears. It is a must listen. Until then, though, a reminder, post-game supporters get the show and the newsletter early on Fridays at 5 p.m. Eastern at the latest, usually way earlier than that. They get extra acts and bonus materials. This week, Patreon listeners got an entire section about what it's actually like to make video games in South Africa. Plus, each month, subscribers get a bonus episode in my ongoing series, Past Games, in which I share deep dive histories into the gaming anniversaries of 2026. The most recent episode, it just went live, tells the history of the original Animal Crossing, which Nintendo released 25 years ago. You didn't play it then because it only came out on the Nintendo 64 in Japan. Anyway, it's a great episode. And no ads on anything. Subscribe to the Patreon at patreon.com/postgames. Subscribe to the newsletter for free at post.games. Postgames logo by James Barham, theme by Mark Sparling. And a special thank you to this week's guests, Ben Myres and Mohale Mashigo. Like the show, leave a review on Apple or Spotify, or share the show with a friend. And now, to take us out, an original song from Relooted. I'll see you next week.
Emajola phumenti longweni ndine nxaka zomzi wami iyo ha ndine nxaka zomzi wami emajola ndine nxaka zomzi wami iyo ha ndine nxaka yo ndine nxaka zomzi olele koloku ndine Emachola pumenti longweni tine ngaka zomzi wami yolenko hayo tine ngaka zomzi wami emachola hayo tine ngaka zomzi wami yo tine ngaka oh yo 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 tine ngaka zomzi wami yo tine ngaka zomzi wami. Emachola pumenti longweni tine ngaka zomzi wami yo hayo tine ngaka zomzi wami emachola yo tine ngaka zomzi wami yo tine ngaka oh yo 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 tine ngaka zomzi olale bologo hayo tine ngaka Emachola pumenti longweni tine ngaka zomzi wami yolenko hayo tine ngaka zomzi wami emachola hayo tine ngaka zomzi wami yo tine ngaka oh yo 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 tine ngaka zomzi wami yo